At 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, my family walked through Terminal B at Logan International Airport, heading to their gate for a vacation to Florida. What they saw next stopped them dead in their tracks. My face, 20 feet tall and professionally lit, staring down at them from a massive billboard above the main concourse. The tagline read, "Meet Dr. Sarah Chen, leading expert in climate science, Harvard Research Institute." My mother's phone clattered to the floor while my father stared up at his daughter, the one he'd spent 3 years calling a professional student with a pointless job, now recognized as one of the country's leading climate researchers. "Where are you watching from right now? If you've ever had your expertise dismissed by people who didn't understand what you actually did for a living, this story's about the moment when recognition becomes impossible to ignore." My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 29 years old, and I've spent the last 6 years building a reputation in climate science, while my family continued to ask when I was going to get a real job that paid actual money. What they didn't understand was that my research was already changing international policy and that the phone calls I received from government agencies weren't social conversations. But let me take you back to where this story really begins, to the family dynamics that made them see my PhD in atmospheric science as an expensive hobby rather than a legitimate career. The Chen family had very specific ideas about professional success, all of which involved immediate financial returns and clear hierarchical advancement. My father, James Chen, had built a successful accounting practice over 30 years, growing from a solo practitioner to managing partner of a firm with 12 employees. My mother, Linda, had worked her way up from bank teller to branch manager before retiring at 55. My brother Kevin, 33, followed the approved path by becoming a software engineer at a major tech company. His salary of $180,000, stock options and progression from junior to senior to lead developer represented exactly the kind of career trajectory my parents understood and respected. My sister Michelle, 26, had earned family approval through her marketing manager position at a pharmaceutical company. Her $95,000 salary, company car, and clear advancement opportunities toward director-level roles fit perfectly into their framework of professional success. Then there was me, the daughter who'd spent 4 years getting a bachelor's degree in environmental science, 3 years earning a PhD in atmospheric science, and 2 years in a postdoctoral research position that paid $48,000 annually while I published paper on climate modeling and Arctic ice sheet dynamics. To my family, my educational trajectory looked like an expensive way to avoid entering the real workforce. PhD meant permanent head damage in their vocabulary, and postdoctoral research meant still can't find a real job in their assessment of my life choices. Sarah's very academic became mom's standard explanation when relatives asked about my career. She's doing research at Harvard, studying climate patterns. Very intellectual work, but you know how these university positions can be uncertain. The subtext was clear. Sarah is smart but impractical, pursuing advanced degrees because she's afraid of business competition, and studying topics that don't translate into profitable skills. This perception was reinforced by my living situation and lifestyle. While Kevin bought a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs and Michelle leased a luxury condo downtown, I rented a small apartment in Cambridge and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. While they talked about stock portfolios and retirement planning, I discussed research grants and publication deadlines. "When are you going to finish school and get a career?" became Dad's standard question at family gatherings. He'd retired from his accounting practice at 62 with substantial savings, investment properties, and a clear understanding of how professional advancement created financial security. My research work was incomprehensible to him. When I tried to explain atmospheric modeling, ice core analysis, or climate feedback loops, his eyes would glaze over with polite incomprehension. "That sounds very complicated, sweetheart," he'd say. "But, are you making enough money to support yourself? And what's your advancement path? You can't be a student forever." What Dad couldn't understand was that I wasn't a student anymore. I was a researcher whose work influenced international climate policy and whose expertise was sought by government agencies, environmental organizations, and academic institutions worldwide. But explaining the impact of academic research to people who measured success by quarterly earnings and promotion schedules was like describing color to people who'd only seen black and white. The breaking point came during last year's Chinese New Year dinner, when Uncle David asked me about my school situation in front of the entire extended family. "Sarah's still at Harvard," he announced with the kind of patronizing affection reserved for family members whose life choices require explanation. PhD in environmental studies, right? Very impressive academic achievement. It's atmospheric science, specifically climate modeling and Arctic research, I corrected. Right, climate research. Very important topic these days. Now. You planning to teach high school science after you graduate? The question revealed everything about how my family perceived my work. Uncle David assumed that environmental science led to teaching positions rather than research careers, and that my current role was temporary, rather than the beginning of a professional trajectory. Actually, I'm already working as a researcher at Harvard's Climate Research Institute. I study ice sheet dynamics and their impact on sea level rise. That sounds fascinating, Aunt Helen chimed in with polite encouragement. And after you finish your research, what kind of jobs will you be qualified for? I was already qualified for the job I was doing, but explaining that felt futile. I'm currently qualified for research positions at universities, government agencies, environmental consulting firms, and international organizations. But what about salary progression? Uncle David pressed. Academic work doesn't usually offer the same financial growth as business careers. Kevin jumped in to support his uncle's point. Sarah, I'm not trying to be negative, but Dad's right about financial planning. My salary has increased by 40% in 5 years. How does academic research compare? The conversation was surreal. My family was discussing my career prospects as if I were a college senior considering options, rather than someone who was already established in their field and making contributions that influenced national policy. What they didn't know, what I'd never found a way to explain, was that my research had gained attention far beyond academic circles. My work on Arctic ice modeling had been cited by the IPCC climate reports. My sea level rise projections were being used by coastal planning agencies. My testimony before congressional subcommittees was influencing climate adaptation funding. But none of that translated into the kind of success markers my family recognized: salary increases, promotion titles, or corporate benefits packages. The conversation that changed everything happened 6 months ago, when I received a phone call that would transform both my career and my family's understanding of what I did for a living. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, from the National Science Foundation, called on a Thursday morning in March with news that would redefine my professional trajectory. Sarah, congratulations. Your proposal for the Arctic Research Initiative has been approved for full funding. I set down my coffee, suddenly paying complete attention. The Arctic Research Initiative was a $320 million 4-year research program I'd proposed to study accelerated ice sheet melting and its implications for global climate patterns. The review committee was unanimous in their recommendation, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Your previous work on ice dynamics modeling and your collaboration with international research teams made you the clear choice to lead this initiative. $3.20 million in research funding. Principal investigator status on a major national research program. Leadership of an international scientific collaboration that would influence climate policy for the next decade. Dr. Rodriguez, this is incredible news. When would the program begin? Immediately. We're also prepared to offer you a permanent research position as senior climate scientist, with a salary of $125,000 plus research overhead and international travel budget. Senior climate scientist. The title carried weight in academic and policy circles that my family couldn't even imagine. But more than the title or the salary, the position represented recognition that my expertise was valuable enough to command significant resources and international attention. There's one more thing, Sarah. Harvard's Public Affairs Office wants to feature your research in their new visibility campaign. They're planning a comprehensive media strategy to highlight Harvard's climate research leadership. What kind of media strategy? Print ads in major newspapers, digital campaigns, and prominent displays in high-traffic locations. They want to use your work as an example of how academic research directly influences policy and public understanding. The media campaign launched in October, 6 months after my NSF appointment, and 2 weeks before my family's planned vacation to Florida. Harvard's public affairs team had created a series of advertisements featuring faculty whose research had real-world impact. Medical researchers whose discoveries led to new treatments, economists whose models influenced monetary policy, and climate scientists whose work informed international environmental agreements. My advertisement ran in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. It featured a professional photograph of me in my laboratory, surrounded by ice core samples and computer models, with text that read, Sarah Chen, Senior Climate Scientist at Harvard Research Institute. Her groundbreaking research on Arctic ice dynamics influences international climate policy and helps coastal communities prepare for sea level rise. But the most dramatic placement was the billboard in Logan International Airport, a 20-foot display visible to thousands of travelers daily, positioned directly above the main concourse where passengers walked between terminals. I had no idea my parents would see it during their vacation trip to visit my cousin in Miami. The call came at 2:47 p.m. while I was in my laboratory, reviewing ice core data from our latest Arctic expedition. Sarah? Mom's voice sounded strange, confused and excited, and embarrassed all at once. Hi Mom, J. Aren't you supposed to be on a plane to Florida right now? We're at the airport. Sarah, we're looking at a giant billboard with your face on it. I set down my data sheets, suddenly understanding what was happening. Sarah Chen, leading expert in climate science. Sarah, there are hundreds of people walking under your picture right now. I could hear Dad in the background asking Mom to put me on speakerphone. Sarah? Dad's voice was completely different from any tone I'd ever heard from him. Sweetheart, this billboard says you're a leading expert whose research influences international policy. Is that accurate? Yes, Dad. That's what I've been trying to explain about my work for the past 3 years. But you're 29 years old. How can you be a leading expert at 29? Dad, age isn't what determines expertise in academic research. Publication record, research impact, and peer recognition determine expertise. I've published 14 papers in top-tier journals. My work has been cited over 400 times, and I'm leading a major international research collaboration. Mom's voice came through the speaker. Sarah, your picture is enormous. Everyone walking through this airport is seeing your face and reading about your research. The Harvard Public Affairs team thought my work was significant enough to feature in their visibility campaign. What exactly do you research? Dee asked, his voice carrying a respect that had never been there before. The billboard mentions Arctic ice dynamics and sea level rise. For the first time in 6 years, my father was asking about my work because he genuinely wanted to understand it rather than find polite ways to dismiss it. I study how Arctic ice sheets respond to warming temperatures and what that means for global sea levels. My models help predict which coastal areas will experience flooding, how quickly sea levels will rise, and what adaptations communities need to make. And this research influences international policy. My work has been cited in IPCC repo RTs, which guide international climate agreements. I've testified before congressional committees about climate adaptation funding. Coastal cities use my projections to plan infrastructure investments. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with my parents asking detailed questions about my research, my position at Harvard, and the significance of the Arctic Research Initiative. For the first time since I'd started graduate school, they wanted to understand what I actually did rather than when I planned to finish doing it. Sarah, Mom said finally, we had no idea your work was so important. Why didn't you help us understand what you were accomplishing? I tried to explain my research, but you kept asking when I was going to get a real job that paid better money. It was hard to communicate the importance of work that didn't fit into traditional career categories. Dad's voice carried genuine remorse. Sarah, I owe you an apology. I've been treating your research like an extended education phase rather than recognizing it as the accomplished career it obviously is. Dad, you measured my success using the metrics that made sense for your generation and your industry. But academic research careers develop differently than business careers. How differently? I explained that academic success was measured by research impact rather than salary progression, by international recognition rather than corporate advancement, and by long-term influence rather than quarterly performance metrics. The $48,000 postdoc salary you worried about was temporary, a training position that led to my current role as senior climate scientist. The research grants I mentioned weren't just academic exercises, they're funding for work that influences national policy. Mom interrupted. Sarah, how much are you making now in your senior position? $125,000 base salary, plus research overhead, travel budget, and benefits. But more importantly, I'm doing work that I'm passionate about, and that makes a measurable difference in how society responds to climate challenges. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet that usually accompanied my career discussions. This was the silence of people processing information that completely changed their understanding of a situation. "Sarah," Dad said finally, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I should have been saying that for years instead of questioning your choices." That evening, after my parents returned from their Florida trip, we had the most honest conversation about career and success that we'd ever had as a Chiwi family. They showed me photos they'd taken of the airport billboard, including shots of other travelers stopping to read about my research. "There were people taking pictures of your advertisement," Mom told me. "Families posing with it in the background." I felt so proud, but also so embarrassed that I hadn't understood what my own daughter was achieving. Kevin and Michelle joined the conversation, and for the first time, our family discussion about careers included genuine interest in my WT work rather than polite tolerance of my academic phase. "Sarah, I had no idea climate research had such direct policy applications," Kevin admitted. "When you talked about ice modeling, I thought you meant theoretical work that stayed in universities. Most of my research does start in universities, but it's designed to answer questions that policymakers need answered. Climate science is applied research. We study climate patterns to help society adapt to changing conditions." Michelle asked about the international aspects of my work. "You mentioned testifying before Congress. What other kinds of influence does your research have?" I showed them my recent publication record, the policy briefs I'd written for government agencies, and the invitations I'd received to speak at international climate conferences. For the first time, my family saw the full scope of what I'd been building while they'd assumed I was avoiding real-world responsibilities. "Sarah," Dad said, reviewing my CV with the same attention he'd once given to business financial statements, "your accomplishments are extraordinary. I feel like I've been blind to my own daughter's success." 6 months later, our family dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of asking when I'd finish school and get a real job, my parents asked about my research findings and their policy implications. Instead of worrying about my financial stability, they bragged to friends about their daughter who advised government agencies on climate adaptation. Most importantly, they learned to measure success by different metrics than the ones that had guided their own careers. Impact rather than just income, influence rather than just advancement, and long-term contribution rather than quarterly performance. The billboard had been a catalyst for conversations that should have happened years earlier, conversations about different paths to professional achievement, different ways to measure career success, and different definitions of making a meaningful contribution to society. If you're still watching at this point, drop Billboard in the comments so I know who understood that recognition sometimes comes in unexpected ways. The lesson I learned from having my family see my face on that airport billboard wasn't about vindication or proving doubters wrong. It was about the challenge of communicating the value of work that doesn't fit traditional success categories, and the importance of persistence when people you love don't understand what you're building. Academic careers, research positions, and policy influence roles develop on timelines and through metrics that are often invisible to people outside those fields. The impact you're making, the expertise you're building, and the recognition you're earning may not translate into the kind of success markers that families typically understand. My parents weren't wrong to worry about financial stability and career advancement. Those are legitimate concerns. But they were wrong to assume that because my path looked different from the ones they understood, it wasn't leading toward meaningful professional achievement. The billboard moment wasn't magic. It was the external validation of work that had been accumulating impact and recognition for years. My research hadn't suddenly become important. It had been important all along, but in ways that required specialized knowledge to recognize. The most valuable outcome wasn't my family's belated recognition of my achievements. It was their willingness to learn about different ways to measure professional success, and to expand their definition of careers worth respecting. Tell me about a time when your family didn't understand the value of your work until they saw external recognition of it. How did that recognition change their perception of what you'd been building? What would you say to someone whose expertise is still invisible to the people closest to them?